Awaken Hardest podcast with John White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Awaken Hardest podcast. I am your host, John White. I gotta say, I'm pretty excited about today's episode. Now, some of you may be a little confused, seeing as the topic and the theme of this season is grief. But I personally am becoming more comfortable with discussing the topic. There's so many things surrounding grief that I'm excited to discuss. Different perspectives that I have gained from others. I've been searching for others like me through social media that are discussing the topic of grief. And I came across this phrase of normalizing grief. And I thought that is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to normalize a topic that I guess is considered a little taboo and it makes people uncomfortable. But since it's a part of me that I can't escape, it's a part of me that I visit every day, and I know that there's tons of other people out there that are experiencing or recognizing this part of themselves, that in a society that's becoming more aware of mental health, there basically just needs to be more conversation around the topic, around the emotion, I guess, and how to make it more a part of our everyday life. So that's what this podcast is about, normalizing grief. Now, I want to start this off by saying this is my little disclaimer. I am not a doctor or a therapist, mental health expert, but I am someone who has dealt with grief in many forms my whole life. So this entire podcast, this season, is just my opinion based on my experiences. I just wanted to get that out of the way. I don't want anybody thinking that I'm some kind of professional. I'm just sharing my opinions, again, based on my experiences. So now that that's out of the way, let's start with what normalizing grief means. I think it's just as simple as this. It's just bringing grief into our everyday discussion in life. In my experiences, it's been whenever I have had too much to drink, hanging out with my friends, and the topic gets brought up. I personally would like to be able to just have a conversation that is normal, not awkward, or a conversation that seems like therapy. I just want to be able to, feel the emotions in my everyday life that I go through out loud. That may be laughing, it may be shedding a tear, it may be a little bit of anger. So that's what normalizing grief to me means. Just getting it out there so that eventually it becomes something that, my kids are living in a world where it's a little easier to discuss things that in the past have been so taboo and made people feel uncomfortable. And I get it sucks. If you're somebody who hasn't lost anybody and you're around people that are going through it, it's definitely difficult, but it doesn't have to be that difficult. Just being present or having a normal discussion without feeling you need to do something, but just be there is enough for most of us in the grieving process. It seems like so many people that are grieving, they feel alienated and they end up alone or feeling alone, which turns into depression or other mental health issues. Now, I want to go on a little bit of a rant. I want to explain how I see grief. If we look at grief as an emotion with a combination of emotions inside of it, I have found feeling these emotions when they come or when I have time to give them attention, which for me is weekly, it helps lighten the heaviness. Look at grief as an energy that if it just sits inside, I see it turning into a tar. I think it needs to be moved or transmuted. it also becomes part of us. And just like any other part, we need to recognize it. We can do this by acknowledging it, acknowledging that this part of us exists. And by doing this, again, we move the energy through expressing our feelings and speaking out our thoughts. One more time. Moving the energy, preventing it from becoming stagnant, healing ourselves. That's how I see grief. It's also why I see so much importance in normalizing the conversation and it becoming more a part of our everyday life in society, not just within ourselves and our friendship circles, but society in general. The world needs to get hip to this shit because all of the pain and terrible things going on in the world, death is the worst of all of it. And being able to live and move on, I wouldn't say move on is the right phrase, but being able to live with grief is so important for all of us. Grief turns into so many things. It makes people form bad habits. In my experiences with all of the numerous deaths that I've went through, there was always drinking involved and some kind of bad habits that I used to help me get through it. And listen, if that's what you do, that's what you do. I don't have a problem with anybody as long as they're getting it out. And if you need a little bit of alcohol to do it, who am I to say don't do that? I'm just saying just don't make it a habit that's how you deal with grief. That's the point of this podcast, is to make this a conversation that we can have when we're sober, and we don't need to be sitting around late at night indulging in terrible food or whatever kind of vices or habits that you develop to deal with your grief. Again, normalizing and talking about our grief, it dissipates the heaviness and it breaks the energy up before it becomes too heavy. And then when it becomes too heavy, drugs and alcohol and all these terrible things start to try to mask it. That's what I've done, at least. That's my experience. Now I'm trying to hit it head on before it becomes the death of me. Another thing I want to talk about is feeling emotions when you're grieving. Crying specifically. I used to only cry when I would get super drunk. Probably even blacked out drunk. I mean, in my 20s, I was getting so drunk and on purpose trying to numb every feeling I had in my body, trying to erase memories, trying to get a fresh start through drinking. And that didn't work. It just caused more problems. The crying part of grieving, it's important for me. I'll just say that. I don't know scientifically what it does, but clearly we cry for a reason. We're releasing something that's inside of our body that doesn't need to be in our body any longer. Especially amongst men, crying is very taboo or looked at as weak. I tell my boys, they're 12 and 13 now, and last year in baseball, they're very sensitive kids. They're tough in their ways, but they're sensitive. And by sensitive, I mean they easily are affected by their environment. They pick up on things, and I think this is a strength. They pick up on things very easily and are very keen to other people's energies, and especially when they're feeling emotions. I've noticed this with my son Jackson. He, if somebody is going through something and he doesn't even know, he walks into the room, he can just kind of sense the emotion. They're not crying or anything. He has, and this is with his peers, he will adjust himself to make sure that they're comfortable. That's what I mean by being sensitive in this particular situation. And so when they played baseball last year, they had two very vocal coaches that yelled a lot. And when you're on a baseball field, you need to yell and you need to be emotional to get your point across, especially when it comes to younger boys. That's my opinion. I grew up playing sports. I think it's a good thing for boys to have that as part of their experience at a young age. Because let's face it, a lot of boys that turn into men, if they don't have some form of discipline, it can be disastrous. And I'm talking about the weakness that men have of recklessness. So going back to crying, they were getting emotional. Jackson would get emotional if he struck out. He'd be crying, which is a normal thing. Most all these kids are, this is something they're going through. There's pressure involved in the situation. Everybody's watching them, and they want to do good for their teammates. And so, they would cry after they struck out or made a mistake, or if they didn't understand what was going on because they weren't paying attention, or they just didn't know what to do, and the coach is yelling from third base across the field to first base, and they make a mistake, they would cry during the game. And I had to explain to them that it's okay to be emotional. And I've always told them it's okay to be emotional and cry out if you have hurt feelings and you have the urge to cry. That's completely fine. But we just can't be running around in public, walking in a grocery store or on a baseball field in the middle of work, crying out of control. That's my opinion. That's an uncomfortable situation for most people to have to deal with. You have to, at some point in time, kind of hold your emotions in. At least that's what I do. And then release them at the proper time. I'm a business owner. With all of my grief, I can't be working on somebody's car, walking up to them in the middle of work as I'm grieving my mother because a song just played and I'm bawling, crying, asking them a serious question. The confusion of that situation, I can't even imagine. So the point being, crying, yes, it is an awkward situation. We need to learn to control our emotions, but I think we also need to normalize that during a conversation, it's okay to shed a tear or get a little emotional, have a tear come out, here or there. That's fine. Hysterical crying is not. In public situations, at least. One-on-one with a friend or a family member or a group of friends and family members, that's, do your thing. Shit, at most of our holidays, there tends to be a big group cry, hug amongst my siblings sometimes, and that's fine, And listen, I'm not trying to put rules on any of this. I'm just, again, trying to talk about my experiences and my perspective and point of view on the situation of grief and how people grieve. You're probably going to notice at times throughout this podcast that I'm going to get choked up. I'm not going to sit on the microphone and hysterically cry. That would be weird, at least in my opinion. Yeah, it's definitely awkward to be having a conversation with someone and something triggers them to start grieving. Something triggers them to be emotional, to get a little choked up within the situation. And that's where things need to be normalized again. Understanding how to deal with somebody in that moment. Now, I'm not someone whose grief is brought on very easily because I think that I pay attention to my grief so much, I'm not easily triggered in most situations, or I don't get emotional very easily in front of people because I talk about my grief out loud. I write about my grief and I deal with it. So when it comes up, say if, for example, the song Everglow by Coldplay came out when my mom died, and I'm not a huge Coldplay fan, but that song was perfect for that situation. And now forever, whenever I hear it, I always get choked up, like right now, thinking about it. No, I'm just kidding. See what I did there? I was just testing you to see if you felt awkward, normalizing it, right? Anyways, you know what? Actually, I'm going to take the second to just talk about this exact situation. Telling a joke, recording a podcast by yourself, and there's no one to receive it. Talk about awkwardness. Insert laugh track, for crying out loud. It is weird. But anyways, back to the fucking hilarious topic of crying. I don't want to repeat myself again, but I don't want to have the urge of crying every time I think of my people. Talking for me reduces the pain when I think of them, and I've learned the more I talk about my grief, the less I am susceptible to being overly emotional. That's it. Some people may find just journaling or writing down how they feel does the same, and I also do that. But again, not to sound like a broken record, moving the energy out of our subconscious before it sits there and lives rent-free, and not to mention is the worst tenant of all time, is the most important lesson I can teach anybody through my experiences. Your grief, your pain cannot sit there inside of you because it will explode at some point in time. It will leak out of you, or you'll have some kind of fucking major breakdown. Look at your body as a vessel for energy. That's another way that I kind of look at everything, from all of my emotions and all of the things, all of the energy I take on throughout the day and through all of my different parts. My creative side, my being a dad, the entrepreneur, all of these different parts of me, they all need some kind of attention, and finding a balance within that and including grief as a part of that, or a part of me. Actually, grief is a little bit different. If I don't pay attention to the creative side of me, there's definitely an imbalance. But grief or grieving, if that's not paid attention to, I've noticed it 100% turns into aggression, anger. I'm easily irritated. So that's why it's more important. If you don't get to feel or express that grief and that loss and that pain that you have in there, it's about to be a big deal. And some regrets are probably going to be had. Maybe even some embarrassment. It's a fucking monster. And one more thing. For those of you who haven't had a significant loss in your life, and you know someone who has, hopefully this podcast will give you a new perspective of understanding towards their loss. But more importantly, and I've said this earlier, just be there. Just be present. Asking every once in a while when that person is distant, not coming out, they don't want to hang out on the weekends or whenever you normally hang out, and they just want to be alone. Ask them maybe if they need some silent company, someone to watch a movie with. Some people like to talk it out like I do. Other people just need someone to be there for them. There's so many different emotions that people feel that those are just two ways that I know most people I've encountered when they have grief, they really just want to be around other people, but they also don't want to feel like a pile of shit because they're hurting so much inside around other people and be the person that brings down the party. They'd like to be at the party, and then there's some people that absolutely don't want to be at the party. When I'm grieving and I'm kind of going through it, I really don't want to be around anybody. I like to be by myself in my safe house where I'm surrounded by all of the tools that I have made to help me get through these moments. My creativity. I have a little altar I built for all my people, and I have candles and the whole deal. Sometimes I like to just sit around and listen to music, read my thoughts in my journals, revisit old ideas and feelings, and fucking cry or smile and laugh. And that's all some of us really need, is a way to feel safe, to be able to express themselves and get this grief out of our bodies. So I think I'll wrap it up right there. I really appreciate, again, all of the comments, messages that people send me and how this podcast helps them. It helps me to know that I'm not just putting this out there. Granted, it's therapy for me, but it just means a lot to know that it's helping others. And to be honest with you, I still don't know how to fucking end these podcasts. I think this is like my 17th or 18th episode, and I don't know what to do here besides say thanks and see you later. If you'd like to learn more about me and my experiences, follow @AwakenHartist on Instagram or visit the website awakenhartist.com.